As our 2,000-year-old Catholic Church marches into the future, Pope Benedict's teachings leave a theological roadmap for the faithful. The late Pope was a framer of Vatican II, the author of 3 encyclicals, and a sort of spiritual arbiter of the pressing moral issues of our time. All of this, yet, as he described himself, a humble worker in the vineyard of the Lord. Joining us tonight in our studio with more on the life and legacy of the former Pope is Father Thomas Petri, Doctor of Moral Theology and President of the Dominican House of Studies. Father Petri, great to be with you.
It's always great to be here, Tracy.
So let's talk a little bit more about Pope Benedict's life, his focus. What stands out most to you?
Well, I think for Pope Benedict, 2 things come to mind whenever I've read him or heard him preach. It's always the focus on Jesus Christ, on bringing Jesus Christ into clarity. That was the focus of his work when he was the prefect at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Whenever there was confusion about Jesus, who he was, mostly because he wants people to encounter Christ as he is, as he reveals himself to be. And then the second thing, of course, the primacy of worship, that the worship of God in the liturgy is the primary way that we serve God and become the persons that we're created to be.
Yeah, and we hear so much about, he was such a great theologian, a great thinker, but what about him as the man? What can you tell us about that?
Well, what we know about him is that he was a very pious child from the beginning, and always had, even though he's clearly, I think nobody would dispute that he's clearly one of the greatest theologians in the Church's history, and especially in the 20th and 21st centuries. But what was characteristic about him was a humility and a meekness. Even those who disagreed with him will testify that in arguments with him, he never seemed to raise his voice. Whenever the discussion would get acerbic in tone, he would always say, the tone needs to be moderated. It's arguments and the truth that convinces. And I think we all witnessed his humility during those 8 years when he was Pope Benedict XVI.
I want to talk about that when he became Pope in 2005. The transition, I should say, from Pope John Paul II. Talk about that.
Well, it seemed like so long ago now, but at the time, remember that John Paul II had been Pope for 27 years, and he had made all of these grand gestures on the world stage. I mean, look at what he did in Poland and helping to bring down the Soviet Empire, him, Ronald Reagan, and Margaret Thatcher. And so when it came time to elect his successor, I think there was a lot of trepidation on who they would elect. At the time, to be honest, I think most people thought that Joseph Ratzinger was going to be the likely candidate. Now, there were quarters in the church that thought, no, he's too conservative, he's too traditional. But everyone knew that he was John Paul's great collaborator. And when he came out on that balcony and they announced him as Pope Benedict XVI, many people in the church, most of the church was just jubilant at that. And he was a great contrast to John Paul II, whereas John Paul was this pope of great magnanimous gestures. Benedict was the more meek and mild pope, but the pope who could teach clearly. And this is one of the things I always admired about him. He could write grand theological books, but also speak in a very simple, humble way so that anybody could understand what he was teaching and preaching.
Yeah, and he did such a great job with that, especially filling those big shoes.
Absolutely, and we saw that throughout his 8 years in the pontificate as Pope Benedict XVI. That, I had friends who were opposed to him. He had this reputation for being God's Rottweiler and the German Shepherd and just this mean person. But when he became Pope, they saw a different side of him. That he actually was just a gentle, meek, humble man who wanted to help anyone he encountered, whether in the thousands or individually, come to know and encounter Jesus Christ as a person, which he said it was the crown and core of Christianity, encountering this person that puts our life on a new horizon and gives us new perspective.
And in 2013, he stunned the world by stepping back from the papacy. I want to talk about the connection between him and Pope Francis, that relationship there.
Well, of course, he lived longer as Pope Emeritus than he was as reigning Pope. He was 9 years as Pope Emeritus, and he only 8 years as the reigning Pope. But we see that Francis always had a tender affection for him. It's been reported that after Pope Benedict died, Pope Francis was phoned, and he was the first person to visit the mortal remains of Pope Benedict and spent 30 minutes in prayer alone with the mortal remains of Pope Benedict. And so you see how Francis, in all of their meetings over these last 9 years, always had an affectionate care and love for Pope Francis, even if I suspect they probably disagreed on some basic issues. They still were fraternal and loved each other.
Father Petri, we're almost out of time, but quickly, wondering any final thoughts?
Well, I know it's been a pattern that we've been canonizing one pope after another. I do pray for Pope Benedict that he's at the throne of God and that we will one day see his canonization. And like many have already said, I agree. I hope one day that he's also declared a doctor of the Church. His rich theological thought was a gift to the Church and to the world.
Father Petri, thank you so much. Always great to be with you. God bless you.
Thank you, Tracy.